Hello there, welcome to the Beat Lighthouse. I'm Lorena from Miami, and today we have a great person here with us, Andrea Iorio. Thank you very much for joining us today, Andrea.
It's my pleasure, Lorena. Thanks so much for having me here.
Andrea, first of all, who is Andrea Iorio?
Well, you might guess from the weird name here in the US or even in Brazil that I'm definitely not from any of these two countries. I'm Italian. You will see here throughout the podcast from my hands gesture, and I know you also speak some Italian, so we'll do a small clip in Italian. But anyways, I've spent 10 years in Brazil where I was the head of Tinder, the dating app, for 5 years. I was also chief digital officer at LOreal. I'm a professor at the most renowned MBA down there in Brazil, Fundação Dom Cabral, and I'm a full-time keynote speaker. I do around 150 events per year to companies of all sizes, of all sectors, mainly B2B sectors, centered around digital transformation. Also since life is not all about work, I also do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm a black belt in Jiu-Jitsu, and I moved here to Miami after 2 years in New York, and that's pretty much about it.
Amazing. So we were born in Italy and lived in Brazil and now in the US. How does this cultural diversity reflect in the professional you've become?
I think that, as a keynote speaker, cultural diversity is key. And I'll tell you why. Because as a keynote speaker, you do have to bring a lot of references, original insights to companies and to the audience that is, attending the event. And so I think that whenever you're able to make a bridge between or among different cultures and bring some insights, for example, from Europe to an audience in the US, or from the US to an audience in Brazil, and from one sector to the other, or maybe even as I do now, across multiple languages, because I do some keynotes in English and others in Spanish and Portuguese. I think it brings that kind of original touch that is so important. And whenever you look at, for example, some of the main digital transformational trends, that is the focus of my keynotes, I'm able, for example, to bring about some trends based out of here in Miami or based out of the US towards the other countries that I do work for, since the US is oftentimes ahead of the curve when it comes to, for example, AI adoption nowadays. And so all the references are here.
First, I would say that I'm very happy to have you today because Miami and Florida in general needs a professional like you. So, but I have to ask you about your move to Miami. Why Miami?
So Miami, I've been following, what has been happening with Miami over the last years, especially after the pandemics. It has become more and more of a tech hub, and I was based out of New York City. And also as a keynote speaker, Miami made more sense because besides the acceleration in tech, the fact that a lot of events are hosted in Miami. And so as a speaker, for example, most of the speeches that I would give out here in the US, even last year when I was based out of New York, would be in Miami or would be in Florida, name it, Orlando, or some of them are in Cancun, which is much closer than any other place in the US, much closer to Miami. And so, I made a quick calculation in my head that it would make much more sense to be here and also to be, again, immersed into this tech culture that has shifted from the Silicon Valley towards, Texas, Florida as well. And so I wanted to be closer to what was happening here in Web3, but not only. Look at AI and a lot of startups relocating here.
You were the head of Tinder and responsible for its expansion throughout Latin America, right?
Right.
You achieved the milestone of having the company you lead dominate the top spot in App Store downloads. What were the key strategies you believe contribute to this success?
So I would say that most of the success from Tinder, first of all, came from the product itself. The product was something that really solved the customer's pain points at the time. It was 2012, 2013. The main dating websites were just, focused on desktop experience. They had no social media integration. They were not gamified. They were very boring and not very, yeah. And so the product itself, Tinder, seeing that in those years people were on their smartphones more and more, and so it would focus only on developing an app integrated with social media, geolocation, gamified with a swipe. And so the product was very successful by itself. And as a consequence of that, it had very high retention and loyalty rates. And so it made the sustainability of the business be much higher than any other product that would, I don't know, like spend a lot of money on advertising and on marketing, but then eventually would not retain their customers. So, well, but that gets me to at least the second part of it, which is marketing. Definitely, not only it was a good product, but it was also very well marketed. That was also part of our duty in Latin America, but across the world. That was of, first of all, bringing awareness around Tinder. That was the easiest part because it went viral, and there's network effects in apps like that. The more people use it, the more people want to download it. So because they're like, wow, everybody's there. It's like social media and so on. But the second part of it was not only bringing awareness, that was the easiest part, but it was changing people's perception around it. So Tinder came to have a very strong hookup, perception. And we did, at least, maybe not a perfect, but a great job at demystifying some of the beliefs that Tinder was just for hookups by showcasing real relationships that would come from that, by working with influencers and content creators to show many more use cases of Tinder rather than just hookup. And so I think there was a combination of having a great product and being able to market it well, but going beyond awareness, going towards shifting perception towards what we thought the product would solve in terms of customers' pain points.
Amazing. And after it, you worked as Chief Digital Officer at LOreal, right? How was the transition from the beauty industry?
Well, that was not only a very deep transition between industries, from tech industry or at least online dating industry to the beauty industry, but it was also between cultures, because Tinder was a very recently established company and a startup. And of course, L'Oreal was 110 years old by then, company with a very strong culture. That was, in a way, which is normal, more resistant to change, more resistant to digital transformation. Whenever you consider a company that has already been very successful across more than century, beliefs start piling up. That's what they've done until then will continue to work in the future. And that was not necessarily the case with, rapidly changing consumer expectations when it came to hair, skin, and beauty, and the rise of influencers, reshaping these beliefs and expectations. The exponential rise of technology, immersive technologies would change beauty and are changing beauty radically. So I would say that the biggest challenges were definitely culture related and beliefs related. It was like a very, very deep change in terms of how much openness there would be towards new idea, towards new shifts in technology, in consumer, and in the market.
Amazing. We know the prestige of MIT in our field. How did the invitation to become a columnist from MIT Technology Review come about? I'm curious about it.
So I started creating content and publishing articles by myself a number of years ago now. I think at least in Brazil, I was one of the earliest adopters of LinkedIn, or at least of the publishing function of LinkedIn. And so going beyond just the recruiting part of it. So I started creating a lot of content, and I started having a good number of followers. Now I count more than 70,000 followers on LinkedIn. And that's, rose some interest into, from some institutions such as the MIT. The MIT Technology Review has their local publication, MIT Technology Review Brazil, which is managed by a team that has the rights of publishing the magazine. And so we decided to focus on basically, like a positioning where I would speak about, again, digital transformation, but not only leadership and soft skills and people management. And that became to be a very successful partnership where I do regularly publish on the MIT Technology Review Brazil my articles once a month. And they're usually pretty successful, and definitely they help out at least me in having more speaking gigs, because a lot of people get to read the magazine, but also the audience that is reading the articles to get to know more about digital transformation and its impact on people within the organizations.
By the way, if you want to update about digital transformation, check it out. He is writing incredible information over there, so check it out. I want to bring more about your investor journey, because I know that one of the top rated app in the App Store, Zen app, you are one of the investors there, right? How it works and why you choose this specifically app to invest?
So I was already, it was maybe 2014, 15, into the, like getting more and more interested into meditation. And I felt that would become a very strong trend. And so I started using, as a user, Headspace. There was a very successful app and, meditation app from the US. And I started thinking, well, could be very interesting to have something like this in Brazil and in Portuguese. And Headspace didn't have any of its content in other languages, and it was only in English. And so I started to be on the lookout. And I was working at Tinder, and of course I wouldn't be able to do it alone because of my job at Tinder, and it was very time consuming. And so I started thinking, well, if I ever bump into an app like this, I'd love to speak to the founders and maybe get involved. And so one day I bump into a LinkedIn post, I think, of a friend of a friend that announced the launch of Zen app. And so I got in touch with the team. I said, look, guys, I really want to be part of this. And we found a deal. I was the first angel investor, and it has proven to be a very successful journey. Zen app has grown to become the biggest Latin American meditation app. Of course, Calm and Headspace are very big players in the sector, but definitely Zen app has been very successful. So yeah, I used a little bit of the expertise that I had gained at Tinder in order to help the founders. But at the same time, it was a great learning experience. And so far, I can say it was just a wonderful experience being an investor at Zen app.
I want to say congratulations on the new book, Meta-leadership.
Thank
We
you.
discussed the leadership in the era of AI and the Web3, right?
Yeah.
Could you tell more about the ideas you share in this project? I really want to understand what motivated you about this book specifically.
So definitely I started researching the impact of AI and Web3 technologies on leadership. And I was able, through my research, to map out 5 big areas of impact. And so when it came to leadership, first of all, making decisions, managing people, looking at the customer, being open to new trends. And so I mapped out these 5 new characteristics, 5 new skills, I would say, of whom I call the meta leader. Meta leader is just a play on words coming from, of course, the metaverse, but leadership as well. And so it's a leader that goes beyond what, of course, meta as the word for beyond, goes beyond the traditional style of leadership. And so the first skill that I map out is what I call reperception, the ability of leaders, of meta leaders in this case, to actually give up of their old beliefs and open themselves to the novelty of an exponential world. The second big characteristic is what I call data sense making, is the ability of leaders to generate insights based on data. The third one is what I call the cognitive flexibility, the ability of leaders to actually make decisions based on a very high number of variables, having this mind and mental flexibility. The fourth is what I call customer centricity, definitely super important. And the fifth is autonomous management. And so basically all together, they represent a new skill set for leaders that want to become better at, again, making decisions, at managing people, at focusing on the customer, at experimenting more. And it was a pretty nice launch. Also, we had a book launch in New York. There was a book launch in LA, and hopefully there will be anytime soon a book launch in Miami. But definitely, it's a book that is for anyone out there that wants to become a better leader, and if they're not leaders yet, that wants to reinvent their skill set and prepare for this new style of leadership.
Will you go deeper in the last one? Because you used to say that leaders should support, be more present instead of micromanagement. It's so interesting. Could you share more about it?
Yeah, definitely. When we think about micromanagement and why it is necessary nowadays, it is only necessary because of the fact that we do not have transparency when it comes to accountability of people, right? So we just lay out a task, or maybe we, tell people to do something, and because there is no transparency, we need to, at least some leaders feel the need to control their teams because they don't have this transparency of the output. Now, whenever through the and this was something that was inspired by how DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, work through the establishment of smart contracts. When we look at how smart contracts work, they're like if-then equations. If you produce this output, then the reward is that. And so whenever the workplace adopts more and more these mechanisms of rewards based on transparent outputs, well, then leaders should focus less on micromanagement, which actually is very good for a number of factors. First of all, by micromanagement, you inherently tell people that you don't trust them and their autonomy to work alone. And so,
Absolutely.
exactly. And so you take away this very big issue that is related to trust. The second big thing is that leaders then save up time and are much better available to focus on what's more important, which is, like focusing on the customer, thinking strategically, and not just micromanaging their teams. And so I think whenever we look at the role of technology and smart contracts, especially as potentially the micromanagers of the workplace, well, then humans will be much freer to focus on much more interesting tasks.
You have been talking about AI for a while and supporting a lot of companies around the world. What are the biggest mistakes companies make when adopting AI?
Well, there's a bunch of mistakes. First of all is adopting it just because it's trendy. And so one of the main mistakes that
Can
we
you
see...
repeat it, please?
Yes, definitely. I mean, this is true. Like you see a lot of companies adopting AI, implementing chatbots or, using generative AI, but without a deeper meaning or without a purpose, or let's say you implement a chatbot that is not very well designed, and instead of improving the customer's experience, you actually worsen it. And so whenever we look at one of the biggest mistakes is definitely this one. A second big mistake is related to the fact that AI only works with data. And so it's there's no point in rolling out AI technologies if we don't have an analytics culture that is able to transform this data into insight and feed the AI with the right set of data, with high quality data, with data that is not biased. And so whenever we, for example, have limited customer data and we want to improve a customer experience, well, we will have a problem unless we don't increase the data points that we get if we want to roll out an AI that really understands and is able to predict our future customers' behaviors. Let's think about, an AI, in a hospital that is looking at, X-rays and trying to, identify cancer in patients. If you just train that AI with wrongful data or low quality data, you will have a lot of problems because they will misdiagnose a lot of that. And the same within companies. That's a big problem. They rush at adopting these technology. And the third one I would say is just rolling out these technologies without training their people. People will be, first of all, scared off by AI and they will think they'll lose their job. Second, they wouldn't know how to use it. And so the first thing is training people and, letting them become able to use better technology, understand it's an ally and not an enemy.
Yes, AI is a tool. We can't forget about the product, about the people, how to learn the best way to use it. So it makes a lot of sense.
Definitely.
How do you view digital transformation here in Florida-based companies, and how can these companies increase their chance of success with this kind of transformation?
No, I definitely do see a much more accelerated digital transformation process, especially after the pandemics. We've seen that in many sectors that were very resistant to digital transformation, but that forced by the pandemics to actually digitize themselves, have proven to do that pretty successful. Let's look at retail, for example. But what I think it's very important is to understand that digital transformation, again, is only successful if, again, people's behavior follows. And so one of my tips is really to not only look at digital transformation as a IT investment, but also to try to balance it out with people's training and people's development. So it comes often from the HR team to work closely with the IT team to basically adopt these technologies, and so not have people unprepared for them. So that's a really strong point that I make throughout my work. There's a lot of people definitely very knowledgeable about the technology itself, but the point that I make is that no technology revolution will be very, very meaningful and successful unless there's also people revolution. So that's what I advocate for.
And how you can support these companies here in Florida, because you have been doing an amazing job in the Brazil, Mexico, and now here in the US. Please share more about how you can support them here.
Definitely. I mean, now being based out of here, I work with a number of companies in their events and internal training and development programs. Again, educating people and creating a sense of urgency that out there things are changing, the customers changing, the market's changing, our competitors are changing, and that if we do not change at the same rate of speed, we run the risk of definitely lagging behind. And so the way that I do this work is through mainly keynote speaking, and so therefore, pretty inspirational speeches around the role of leadership, around customer centricity, around the role of technology as well, but also through workshops, trainings, and even podcasting, which is something that I've been doing for a number of brands, especially NVIDIA, the AI company. I'm the official host of their Brazilian podcast. So I would say that across all of these learning and development educational programs, but starting off always from keynote speaking, which I think is a very powerful tool for organizations to reshape and change their people's behavior. Because you put someone on a stage and, 1 hour of, full attention can be very, very transforming for a lot of people if the speaker is good enough, definitely.
I recommend, by the way.
Yeah.
I hear about a reputation. You used to say about it, and I'm curious about the pillars of building a reputation. What are and why are they so important?
I mean, reputation is key because whenever we look at any hiring of any speaker or even trainer, but let's focus on speaker, the main factor that is considered is the speaker's reputation. Because let's think about it. If you are an HR manager and you're organizing an event for all of your teams, or you're the CFO of the company, or whomever is hiring the keynote speaker, let's say that you have 1 or 2 big events per year, right? It's the end of year convention. you really want to make sure that the person you're putting on that stage, that you're hiring for that, is really, really good and is not only knowledgeable about the topic, because there's a lot of knowledgeable people out there, but he's also a great communicator, a great keynote speaker. And so they want to be sure about that. And so the only thing that makes people sure about that is the reputation. And the reputation, you build the reputation through a number of factors like past successes. So the more keynotes that you gave, the more reputation that you have, of course, if they're good keynotes. But so it's like a snowball effect. The more reputation you build, the more keynotes you sell. And the more keynotes you sell, the more reputation you build. So it's like a virtuous cycle. And so it is key, again, because people do not hire you because of your marketing initiatives. They do not, well, I mean, for keynote speaking, again, it's not because like you're over there like on a Google ads and things like these, but they hire you, again, because of your reputation. And that's extremely important.
Amazing. The business world is often described by the term VUCA. How do you believe companies can effectively prepare and adapt to this ever-changing environment?
Well, I mean, the term VUCA, VUCA, is a term that has been used a lot to describe such an exponential and unpredictable environment. What I think that it's really important for us to understand is that whenever we look at it, there's no real way to predict the market as before. Before, when there were like linear changes or like, not so quick nor exponential changes, you would be able to prepare yourself much better. Nowadays, it's much harder to prepare yourself for such an environment. And so the main thing is not like prediction, but it is about preparation. It is about learning to become flexible as an organization and work more in a more agile manner, test and learn and make quicker decisions based on data.
I would say more than ever. Because
more than ever,
the market
exactly.
had changed, so you have to adapt.
Exactly. And so all of this is extremely important. And whenever we look at all of this, we have to be able to make more and more informed decisions and quicker decisions. And so that's the way that I think companies should deal with this VUCA word. Being more agile, learning even sometimes with mistakes, and using data to make better and faster decisions.
Amazing. Looking at the startup landscape, we often see many struggles to the lack of demand of their products or services.
Yeah.
In your experience, what are the main factors that lead these startups to overlook this gap from the start?
So I think it's very much related to the way that they look at demand for a certain product or service. Sometimes we see startups launching something just because they think that is important for the market, but that's a belief that the founders have. It's not really based on the real demand. So
I'm in love with my own product, but
exactly.
I'm not looking at the market needs, right?
Exactly. Or maybe, it's even looking at some of the market needs, but like not being able to really read their data. I'll make an example. When Steve Jobs was about to launch the iPhone, it was 2006, he was doing focus groups. And all the focus groups were pointing to the fact that people wanted a bigger version of a BlackBerry. Everybody was asking for a bigger keyboard, and nobody ever asked for a touchscreen phone as the iPhone is. Why? Because innovating is not necessarily responding to what your customer wants, but it is anticipating what they need without even knowing. And so I think there's a number of things that are very much related to the way that we're able to identify demand for a product or service that startup do wrong. What they do wrong is that sometimes they launch things that solve the founder's problems and not necessarily the customer's problems. Second is that sometimes they ask the customers what they want, and that does not necessarily mean it's really innovative. And then sometimes it's definitely totally misunderstanding the demand and misunderstanding the data and launching something that has no real demand.
I will mix the two last answers because I think that there is a lot of sense in it. Because if you don't have all the answers, and you never have,
Yeah.
you have to try it, you have to validate it and adapt. So
That's
I
correct.
always remember about the history of 20 miles, and I think that is fit a lot because exactly, if you don't have all the answers, you have to put the application in the user's hands as soon as possible.
Yeah.
And understand the feedback, the data. So if you could share about the 20 miles history here, because I think that it could help a lot the founders and all the owners of the startups to understand better this kind of mindset.
Of course. It's a great story by Jim Collins, the great author, that said that in 1911, two expeditions were fighting, kind of like competing to see who would reach the South Pole by feet faster. And so on the one side, there was the British explorer Scott. And Scott, he had this strategy where he'd, focus on doing as much as he could on very good days, like sunny days, and resting on very cold days, like snowy days. And on the other side, Amundsen, the Norwegian, he had another strategy. He would focus on doing 20 miles every day. Every day, not more, no less. He would focus on doing those 20 miles marches. And he would always change something every day, to try out new things. And he would keep what worked and he would set aside what didn't work, right? Constantly learning, almost as a scientist, right? Well, history told us that Amundsen was the first man to ever reach the South Pole. And Robert Falcon Scott, and his whole expedition died on the way back. And so the message here is the following, that sometimes in companies we focus too much, as Robert Falcon Scott, on those few 100, 200, 300 miles marches that are like those macro projects that we decide behind closed walls, and so without really getting the real world feedback. But instead, we should do like Amundsen, focusing on small, actionable steps where we always learn with each interaction, and we scale what works and set aside what doesn't. And it's the sum of these 20 miles marches that bring us much, much, farther than the rest. And so I think it's very important for us to understand the power of 20 miles marches in businesses, especially in a rapidly changing environment.
Andrea, thank you very much for being here today. I'm impressed with your knowledge and the way that you bring your mindset to support so many companies around the world. So please, if you have a final message to share.
Thank you, Lorena, actually, for inviting me here and being able to share a little bit of my knowledge. Nothing. If anyone is interested in reaching out, you can find me on my website, andreaiorio.com. All the content is there. And definitely, I'm here around the Miami area and available for any contact. And so I really wanted to thank you again for the invitation. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you very much. See you guys. Bye-bye.
See you.